Hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining me. My name is Carrera Peterson, and this is my presentation of Instructional Design and Leadership, the Perfect Match. So as you can see, this is blending two things: instructional design that we all deal with on the daily, and then leadership, which some of us may know a bit about, some of us not so much, but leadership in general has been a focus of study and has gotten a lot more attention in the past few years. So I completed my bachelor's work in organizational leadership, so I had the chance to learn a lot about past studies of leadership, current studies, how it affects several areas of business, etc. So let's go ahead and dive in. Teaching leadership, but more importantly, designing the instruction needed to teach leadership is no easy task. Leadership can be used in many ways in our field, which is why we keep seeing leadership models and lessons built into our instructional design. Regardless of the learning model or the subject matter, leadership will always be intertwined with the design of instruction in some general way. We need our information to be measurable, and we need our output to be effective. And because of this, it's beneficial that both instructional designers and learners build leadership strengths. Now, we can't all be leaders, but that doesn't mean we have to all be followers either. When it comes to specific aspects of the creation of learning and the learning experience, blending what we now know about leadership with designing effective instruction could be the perfect match. Now, we do have some learning outcomes, things I want to make sure that you know is coming up that we're going to go over. There are 3 things that we're going to cover today as we go through instructional design and leadership, the perfect match. We're going to discover how leadership is tied closely with instructional design. We'll see why integrating leadership studies into instructional design models increases effectiveness of the actual output after instruction is complete, and then learn leadership principles that you can incorporate into your instructional design process. So those are 3 key areas that we're going to go over and we're going to see as we go throughout our presentation. We're also going to go over some of the dynamics of building out and initiating the instruction itself. So let's go ahead and get into the rest of that there. All right, leaders. Now, as I said before, some of us have maybe more of a background in knowing more about leadership studies. Some maybe not so much. So let's go ahead and jump into our needs statement. There is a scenario, so here is the scenario. An instructional intervention is needed for your company's current and future team. There are inconsistencies among the leadership team as it stands, which has been causing communication issues and errors in task management. The need for a possible instructional intervention was discovered through feedback from team members, current leaders, and upper management. Even human resources has gotten involved at this point, which we all know is never a good sign. One major problem you were able to identify right away, if this is a case that you're looking into, if there does need to be an instructional intervention, is that there's not currently any formal new hire training for leadership. And I think, as some of us might attest to, when it comes to having consistency in an organization, consistency among teams, team members, how tasks are completed, output, so we can measure and make sure our goals and standards are met. A lot of that ties to expectations that are set at the beginning of a team member coming onto a role, or having to do with a team member or group that is brought into an environment where they might have to have a specific project set up with parameters for timelines and expectations of tasks for that project. So really important to make sure we all do that background work, that work before the work actually begins, which is setting up what our goal is and defining what is going to be successful for us. So one major problem, as we said, in this specific case scenario, is there was no formal new hire training or leadership training. So as we all know, the inconsistencies in workflow and task completion has the likelihood to increase errors and cause communication breakdowns between team members, leaders, and their teams. To start this intervention, we need objectives here to go towards our goal. Designing effective instruction states objectives perform two important functions for instructional designers, instructors, and teachers. First, they offer a means for the instructional designer to design appropriate instruction, specifically to select and organize instructional activities and resources that facilitate effective learning. The result is a highly focused unit of instruction. So, this is where it all begins, and we can start to see how teaching leadership traits will tie into building out the instruction. All right. So the next area I want to cover is ethics. I'm sure many of us are familiar with ethics, whether it's personally, professionally. Ethics is something that we have to weigh and consider and deal with on the daily, morning to night. It's just part of life. But when it comes to building out instruction, ethics is something that as instructional designers we have to consider as highly important and at the forefront of building out instruction. Now, before we go into how leadership and instructional design tie together, let's look at an important piece in all of this, which is ethics. The ethical implications that tie into leadership are vast and far-reaching. Ethical practices affect leadership and can determine the trajectory of a team and an organization. Examining any ethical elements that do not line up with the team's future goals can save time and reduce errors. When you gather data prior to building out your design structure, each learner can be assessed by looking into their background and the time spent within their role. This is some basic information we can gather from their employee files working with local human resources. What also needs to be looked at is each learner's attitude and understanding of leadership, which may require a focus group or some type of background work there. Rapid instructional design states you might want top performers, particularly if you are doing a competency analysis. These individuals can be found by comparing their years of experience to their ranking in the organization. Those with a great deal of experience and high rankings should be top performers. To obtain such rankings, do an informal poll of coworkers and supervisors, asking simply, who's the best at this? Or who do you go to when you have a problem? So the group of learners might share the same generational age group or not. There may be varied cultural and gender variabilities that need to be taken into consideration when we think about ethical implications. All this needs to be designed into the instruction so that all learners can relate to and grasp the concepts introduced in the training modules. Not all learners will absorb the information as well if the instruction is not built to be unbiased. With any proposed instruction intervention, there needs to be consideration made for legal implications, and whatever is surrounding the instruction needs to be addressed. Leaders are in a situation within an organization where they need to be at the face of the company for team members as they lead, as well as an advocate for their team members regarding policies, procedures, and work-related job functions. This places leaders with the need to create balance between these two worlds and wearing many hats. With this leadership training, liability to the company can be reduced and risk kept low. Designing effective instruction states, as an instructional project manager, you must ensure that the training program you oversee is ethical and meets legal requirements to avoid liability claims and lawsuits. Therefore, you should become knowledgeable about contracts as well as state, federal regulations, and statuses. Me being in California, when it comes to state regulations and laws and employment practices, it's definitely one thing with my background in human resources and also getting into instructional design is at the forefront of the workplace in California here. Now, the fact is that better leaders make better leadership decisions. Does this mean leaders never make mistakes? No. But by integrating in leadership practices and skill sets, any instructional design theme, regardless of the subject, will benefit. While there may be limited or no legal liability surrounding the creation and completion of the instruction itself, there could be increased legal liabilities if leaders are not consistent and ethical in their practices. Each member of the leadership team may currently have a different ideology of what a leader is and what a leader does in and out of the workplace. Redefining these ideologies, if needed, and assessing where to go from there can cause some conflict stemming from various backgrounds and experience levels of leadership. Designing effective instruction states most professionals would agree that one could be liable for including discriminatory materials in a training program. Now, this was indicated that an activity designed to improve diversity could be used as evidence of discriminatory practice. So we have to be really careful if we are going to incorporate something, how we're presenting that. With this knowledge in hand, it must be well planned out to execute achieving the desired training outcomes. Each member of the leadership team will come into this training with varied leadership knowledge and understanding of their own leadership practices and that of others. There will need to be safeguards in place to be sure biases are not present, and liability to the company and the instructional intervention is kept low to none. When we think about liability, how does teaching leadership and building leadership traits and tools into instructional design help reduce liability? The answer is clear. Quality and effective leadership considers ethics in all processes and procedures. Good ethics are always on the agenda for good leaders. Designing effective instruction states employees must have equal access to training within the company. Screening methods must be applied equally to all groups and be non-discriminatory. To avoid discriminating or assuming details, training must be comprised in a way that starts all learners off on the same base point before taking off into deeper areas of each subject. The plan is to treat the entire audience equally, regardless of race, gender, or cultural background, while also taking into consideration any roadblocks each learner might have that has been identified. Now, we're going to get into communication, and I'm sure we all know communication is important, and communication is one of the major things that employees and various members of organizational groups give feedback on that is a pain point and a need to be improved. So there are 3 measurable outcomes which stem from the instructional intervention that's needed in this case study we're looking at. Effective instructional design states the scope of work provides a definition of the boundaries of a project. This definition is used to gain a consensus among all the stakeholders concerning the purpose of the project, why it is being done, and the expected outcome of products. Team members who are now in and will be in the leadership roles upcoming will be expected to prove the ability to communicate effectively as a leader, a peer, and a team member. Those within the leadership team will also need to display the skills needed to give and receive constructive feedback. Lastly, the leadership team will need to display the skill sets required that is needed to build trusting relationships among team members and peers. So why is communication so important? Effective communication is crucial to several areas of the business and is needed for leaders to be positive examples for their followers and peers. Communication is one of the most needed areas of improvement that is expressed by employees, managers, and human resources. Constructive feedback, which is part of the communication process, is important for leaders in every role, as this directly relates to the development of team members and the increased productivity of each team member. Trusting relationships are built because of enhanced effective communication. Next is performance outcomes and alignments. Each learning outcome has a corresponding performance outcome attached. These performance outcomes must be measurable to be sure after the instructional intervention is complete, the required results are met. Now, designing effective instruction states an instructional objective should focus on outcomes or products rather than on the process. If you're not sure whether what you are stating is an objective, ask yourself, is this outcome what I want the learner to know or demonstrate after completing the topic unit? For a learner to display effective efficiency in communication, they'll need to show the ability to communicate with various team members of their team in several different ways, which will include email, instant messenger chat, and of course in person verbally. Learners will also need to prove an increase in communication by taking steps towards the completion of tasks related to more one-on-one time with team members and peers, both in person and remotely. For a learner to prove efficiency in giving and receiving constructive feedback, there will need to be 2 measurable outcomes. First, the learners will need to prove they can set up meetings on a regular basis between the team members they lead and the leadership they report to. Secondly, learners will need to show they can give and receive feedback and stay positive and constructive throughout the process. Learners will need to prove they can build and maintain trusting relationships between all team members. They will need to prove this by displaying respect for all team members and doing that verbally and non-verbally through cues. In addition, learners will take additional steps needed to build trust by showing the ability to go above and beyond by setting up team member activities for team building and setting up other related activities to build instructional strategies. And that brings us to instructional strategies. So learners will need to be able to perform professionally daily using their new skill sets and tools they've learned through the instructional intervention. There will be 3 outcomes here. The first outcome is to prove the ability to communicate effectively as a leader and a team member. They will also need to be able to display outcomes from the skills needed to give and receive constructive feedback, and effectively use the skill sets acquired, which is needed to build trusting relationships among team members. Designing effective instruction ads. Sample strategies include analyzing key ideas, which require the learners to identify the key ideas and then interrelate them, outlining and categorizing them. For performance outcomes to be effective, certain resources will need to be used. Many projects rely on not just planning, but on resources. There are projects that may have excellent planning, but because the scarcity of resources fall flat, they don't have much success. With each learning outcome, there's a specific delivery method of instruction that must be chosen. This delivery method was chosen as being the best option in which to relate the information to learners and assess how well they're retaining the information previously given. More than one delivery method will be needed for each learning outcome. Rapid instructional design does confirm there is no rule that says you cannot use more than one delivery system for a single training event. In fact, many of the most successful training processes combine delivery processes. This concept, often termed as blended learning, has received a lot of publicity as of late due to the popularity of e-learning. Having learning information accessed through various mediums can increase retention and assist in the engagement process by breaking large chunks of information into smaller bites. While there might be in-person on-site instruction, a learning management system will be needed for coursework done online. eLearning.com states, the worker accesses the learning management system, is prompted to watch the video, listen to the recording, and then practice the skill immediately following. Tests and quizzes are required to measure the employee's competency concerning the skill. The result is that the employee is able to confidently perform and remember the skill and retain the learning by at least 75%. With historically high success rates, we can incorporate blended online learning and anticipate high learner retention outcomes. There can be a blended assessment approach within the course outline as well. Multiple choice questions and scenario-based tests can be offered to learners both throughout the instruction and as a final exam at the end of the coursework. ShiftLearning.com states, scenario-based learning SBL courses combine the magical appeal and relevance of stories with the realism of hands-on training within a virtual environment. Virtual scenarios let learners gather professional expertise and experience within a much shorter duration than what they would have obtained from just working at their real jobs. And we have our project timeline. So there's going to be 3 phases, as you can see. Phase 1 is planning, phase 2 is the actual execution, and phase 3 is the wrap-up. So with phase 1 of the leadership training timeline, it would include all the background work needed prior to implementation with the learners of the instructional intervention. This phase would take roughly 2 weeks, depending on the resources and availability of the various groups involved in the planning. Phase 2 will consist of the actual instruction and testing of the learners. It will be a 3-week course in total. The first 2 weeks will have 3 units on each of the learning outcomes. The third and final instruction week will consist of an overview of all 3 learning outcomes and a final exam. And phase 3, which is the final phase, will require 2 weeks of time to complete and will consist of a wrap-up of the instructional intervention itself. There will be an in-person Q&A session hosted, along with one-on-one feedback from SMEs of learners on quizzes and final test results. I want to thank you so much for your time and attention during this presentation of Instructional Design and Leadership, the Perfect Match. We covered the importance of good instructional design and the importance of learning leadership within several areas of our field. Leadership is valuable to learn and exercise in creating instruction as an instructional designer, giving instruction as an instructor, and receiving instruction as a learner. Now we know how to incorporate leadership practices into each step in the instruction process and how valuable learning these leadership skills truly can be. I'll go ahead and open up the floor for any questions or comments you may have. And if you would like to go ahead and access my slide and review any of the references, you're welcome to do so. And that will conclude this. Thank you so much for attending and have yourself a good afternoon.